Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're watching India Tonight with me, Sumita. Kareer. Let's discuss our top story tonight. Is India, what is really standing in the way of India hitting its climate goals? Well, as per India's submission to the UNFCCC, we are on track to achieve our climate goals that have been set under the NDCs. In fact, India has already managed to reduce its emission share in the GDP by 36% over 15 years. It also says that we've also added a huge carbon sink to combat greenhouse emissions. But as much as we'd like to think, or as much as the data claims that we are on track, there's certainly a few challenges ahead. What are those challenges, and how are those challenges really impacting India's economy? To discuss and more aspects of that story, I'm now joined by Sehr Raheja, the Program Officer, Climate Change Centre for Science and Environment. Thank you very much, Sehr, for joining us this evening on ET Now. First things first, when we speak about India's transitioning into clean energy, we do have various schemes like the PM Surya Ghar Muft Bijli Yojana, the National Bioenergy Program. But what is your overall assessment of the claims that have been made? Is India on track to meet its climate commitments based on the latest updates that we've gotten?
So thanks a lot for having me here. I think I can just start by saying a few lines on what these latest updates are, and then get into what we kind of at CSC think they really mean. As you mentioned, the latest biennial update report that India submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has given a set of new data. And among the top three kind of findings have been, like you said, that the emissions intensity of GDP has reduced by about 36% compared to 2005. There's been an additional carbon sink, and that the total non-fossil electricity generation capacity, installed capacity of India has increased. It's more than 40% of the total. But I think there are certain nuances for each of these points, and a few more that I can add, which kind of show that we need to think a little bit more about what this means. This is certainly progress, but a lot more needs to be done. So for instance, when it comes to renewable energy or the non-fossil capacity for a country like India, yes, it stands at about 203 gigawatts at the moment as of October last year, which is the latest data that's been released by the government. And it also comprises about 46% of the total mix of installed capacity in the country. But when it comes to actual clean power generation, it's lagging behind at only about 13% in the total mix, compared to a 70% of our power which still comes from coal. So then that makes you think a little bit about what these figures in the latest update really mean. So that's about energy. And when it comes to emissions intensity of GDP, I think that two factors need to be kept in mind while looking at these kind of data points. One is that usually an increase in the GDP is what causes a reduction in the emissions intensity of GDP. Because if you have a larger growth factor compared to individual unit emissions, then that overall figure or that data point or that statistic is going to reduce. But we need to look at also in the same breath is the increased absolute emissions. So the latest update does in fact say that absolute emissions also decreased in 2020 compared to 2019, if we're talking only about that annual change. But we have to remember that this was a year of COVID-19. And so COVID-19 meant that it was a year of absolute stalling of economic activity, particularly emissions from transport and industry and power generation. And the patterns were very, very different. So it was an anomaly. Yeah.
Right, Sehr. So you're talking about a whole host of things in one answer. And of course, we'll try and touch upon some of those over the next couple of minutes. But very interestingly, you said that emissions have reduced by 36% of the GDP, which is what also the declaration claims. But clean power generation, while you may say that that has increased, while our clean energy capacity generation may be increasing, but we continue to rely on coal to meet about 3/4 of electricity demand. So clearly the dependence on the dirtiest fossil fuel is likely to continue. In terms of sectoral emissions as well, I mean, I'm just going through what the report says. It is energy as a sector that has the highest emissions, followed by agriculture and of course industry. In fact, the Power Ministry also unveiled a plan last year to add almost 90 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity through 2032. So the big question is, can India then meet the targets that it has set for itself in the near term and long term?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I could answer that question, then we might not be needing to have these debates at all on TV, But I think there are a couple of parts to this. So you've mentioned a few things, and I'll begin with the first one, which is that 13% figure of actual generation, which I mentioned. So essentially, there's a difference between what is your installed capacity and how much power generation is actually happening from a particular source. India's transmission and grid infrastructure has been built so far for coal and fossil fuel-based power electricity generation. So there are multiple reasons why that uptake or that translation of the installed capacity into a lot of generation has not happened. This is not to say that it's not happening or that it isn't going to happen. This is just to say that it's lagging behind at the moment and a lot more needs to be done. The International Energy Agency has also predicted that India's power consumption and so demand is expected to grow at an average of at least 6% for the next couple of years until 2026. In 2023 alone, we saw power demand growing by 7%. So while the NDC commitment of meeting at least 50% of that from non-fossil sources by 2030 is on track through capacity addition and through efforts at smart grids, through better transmission infrastructure, through getting finance to do exactly these things. It has also been predicted that about a third is going to come from coal, like you just said, because the reality is that there is power demand for a growing economy, for a country that still has energy poverty in several parts of it, and for a country that has an industrial sector which it is difficult to abate. Like the whole world is finding it difficult to reduce emissions to the extent needed in sectors like steel or cement, which are the hard to abate sectors. So there are certain policy measures that are being put in place, I guess, but it is an uphill task. And one example of what is being done in order to actually accelerate this kind of decarbonization is that India recently unveiled its green steel taxonomy. So for a sector like steel, which is very emissions intensive and it's hard to abate, that's a step in the right direction. So in the short term, it looks a little bleak, but in the medium term,
and absolutely,
efforts are underway.
Yes, efforts are underway, and of course, not just in the power sector, but several other sectors as well. For example, EV, the transition to EV is something that India is, and of course, the government is pushing all stakeholders and of course, all its citizens too. There are several subsidy schemes as well that have been continuing over the past few years. But when the opposition says, Sehr, that the government is dismantling environmental protections and regulations, but at the same time, it's going on, global events, going to global events and claiming that it is going to, be reducing its emissions. How do you really respond to that?
This is a dichotomy that I think a lot of developing countries do need to do. And I think there's more to it than just kind of saying that this is a contradiction sometimes, right? So, of course, we have seen a weakening of certain environmental laws in the country. There has been a certain kind of shift in what's happening at the subnational level. But it is also true that compared to the global north counterparts, a country like India has had a very minimal contribution, historically speaking, to the emissions that have pretty much caused the crisis and brought us to the place that we're in. India contributed about 3% to the global historical emissions that we talk about when we're talking about the discussions that went into coming up with the temperature goals under the Paris Agreement, the most, ambitious decision yet that has come out of these talks. So it's difficult, and it can seem contradictory, but it is still a country that needs to ensure just decent energy access and clean cooking fuels to so many of its citizens. So while there is an effort to reduce emissions, there's also multiple other battles that countries like India are, I guess, facing. That's one way of looking at it.
Every small step goes a long way. For example, the Prime Minister Surya Ghar Yojana, for example, is one example of the government moving in the right direction. But definitely there are several challenges around funding and capacity building as well. But help us understand how much of an impact is this going to have on India's economy?
You mean climate, just climate change and its links to the impacts on economy?
Yes.
Is that your question?
Yes,
Right.
yes.
So I think every sector, what we're looking at in a global level as well as in India is a kind of need to rethink how economies even function, and need to factor in the risks that are brought in by the impacts of climate change. So one example that I think everyone can relate to or really understand is that of extreme weather events and the destruction that is caused by them. When a cyclone hits, or when there is heavy rainfall, or when there's unexpected flooding, or when there's a heat wave, not only are there deaths in a country like India, but there's also damage to infrastructure, agriculture, crop loss. There's a lot of price rise and food inflation. So there are multiple aspects, different sectors, different aspects of the economy are impacted both directly or indirectly, apart from impacts on infrastructure. And then that's like the real economy. But even financially, the risks posed by climate change are increasingly being taken up by the Reserve Bank of India. There are many things that need to be factored in. So is there a link between the impacts of climate and the various extreme weather events that it is inducing on, say, price stability and monetary policy? The answer seems to increasingly be a yes. So yeah, I'll stop there for now.
All right, Seher, so lots of challenges ahead, but definitely India is moving at least in the right direction. At least a start has been made. And of course, there are regular updates on how much of those goals are being met, at least the progress on those goals. Thank you very much, Seher, on that note, for joining us this evening on ET Now and discussing that very crucial story. Ladies and gentlemen, time for us to slip into a quick break, but coming up after the break, MeitY, or the IT Ministry, has released draft rules of DPDP Act for public consultation. We'll tell you what the rules are and more details related to this big breaking story right here on ET Now. Do join us back after this short break.